Hey there, the E-Man here. I guess today I wanted to talk about something or do a reading from a book. I guess you could say this is somewhat a book review, I guess. Yeah, I don't know if a lot of you have ever seen the Dark Crystal movie by Jim Henson, like kind of released out in like 82 originally. Yeah, I remember watching this on TV on CBS like many years ago. Yeah. Yeah. As you see, my bed's a little messy, but trying to think about it. Anyway, here's a novelization. It was written by H.C.H. Smith, illustrations from Brian Froud. It's a novelization. Now, there's also a novelization of Labyrinth. If I said that right, yeah. Labyrinth, that other Jim Henson movie. There's also a novelization of that. And the novelization really adds a lot to it. I really love this book. I think I was able to finish this book in 2 days because it's very well done. No, I'm going to try to read. Let's see. I'm going to try to read just one chapter. I think the first chapter. I've got this picture of Ryan Froud's illustrations of the Chamberlain. I think that's the Chamberlain right there. Okay. Right. Let's see. Okay. The Dark Crystal novelization, Chapter 1. In the Forge of Thunder. There was only Jen alone. His favorite game was to blow his flute and imagine other Gelfling from just beyond the first trees. Summoned by his music, creeping up behind him as he sat beside the waterfalls, they would be smiling because they would think they were hidden from Jen by the rocks, and when he stopped playing his flute and quickly turned around and caught sight of them moving, they would be obliged to stay with him then and live with him forever in the valley of the Uru, or the mystics, or Uru is kind of a different term to call them, I guess. It was only a game he played on his own. Below the waterfalls were the green pools in which he swam. He dived down to the weeds, then turned face upward and floated very slowly back to the surface, watching the sunlight above him dance and shudder and dance again, like the hot metals in the pans of Ur-Tai the alchemist used. The creatures of the pools swam past him unafraid, knowing him. The yellow and brown Marhe, the long wiggling Kira kids. Jen had always swam with them in their pools, ever since the Uru had brought him to their valley to live with them. He pretended that the creatures in the pool and those on the land and of the air were his friends, as they were indeed, but friends with whom he could not converse. Only the Uru could speak Gelfling to him, and they always did because their own language was too difficult for him to learn. The Uru were his real friends, of course, but it was difficult to think of them as friends. They were so immensely old and slow and huge and abstracted from everyday things. Jen squinted at the sky. It was behaving strangely today. They were kind to him, the Uru, even though they never cooked food he liked. He could not remember what Gelfling meals were, could only remember his mother as a shadow over his small body, but he was convinced that somewhere there was food he would relish. It did not grow in the valley. The Uru would answer if he questioned them when he pointed to berries he would have liked to eat. They forbade him to, in fear he might be poisoned. Wise ones, Jen would say. That was what their name meant, Uru, the old and wise ones. Won't your wisdom tell you if these purple berries are poisonous or not? They would shake their great mournful heads, thin gray hair brushing over their ears. Wisdom is not for knowing, but for understanding, was their answer. Our food is good for you. It will suffice. We cannot know what is bad for a gelfling. Eat up and grow strong. The Uru loved him. Jen knew that. Outside the valley, with its rocks and cascading pools, its trees, berry bushes, flowers, and grasses outside, beyond the boundary of the outer standing stones, there must be, he thought, a place where gelfling food grew, a place where gelfling had once lived, where he had lived with his mother and father, when his mother and father were alive. He thought he could remember being among many gelfling. Where had they all gone, he would ask. Why may I not explore outside this valley? You might lose your way, the Uru would reply. One of you could come with me. No, little one, we cannot leave the valley. Not ever? Not yet. When? Then, not yet. One day, will you? And may I come with you? One day, they would say. Yes, one day you will leave here. When? At that they would raise their old lined faces, looked pensively at the sky, and walk away slowly. Oh, how sad they seemed to Jen, these weary, kind faces of theirs. I would take my flute with me, he offered. I would play it all the time I was outside the valley so that you could always come and find me again. Not yet, little one. And so he stayed in the valley and played his flute. It was a double flute, and he had learned to play harmonies on it. The Uru encouraged him to practice, and he thought they must have given him the flute in the beginning. Anyway, he could not remember a time when he did not have it. Sometimes Ur-Sol, the chanter, sang while Jen played. He was a fine musician, Ur-Sol, and could sing a third row of harmony holding Jen cupped in his hand by his head. The only difficulty they had was that Sir Sol's voice was loud and deep, sufficient to make the rocks vibrate, to accompany quietly enough so that Jen's flute could be heard. He had to keep his mouth almost closed in a sort of humming, and that, he said, was hard work. The sky today disquieted Jen. The wind kept changing its direction, as he could easily tell from the different patterns of ripples fleeting across the surface of the pools. He had been woken up by thunder, although it was far away, and all day the sky had been rumbling. The Cur kids were educated in their pools once Jen had thought he felt the ground move and had glimpsed something like a spark traveling across the valley and over the rim of rocks above it. It had gone so fast he could not be sure that he had glimpsed something like a spark traveling across the valley and over the rim of rocks above it. It had gone so fast he could not be sure what it was. He had run along the spiral path, past the 18 caves halfway up the cliff to survey the valley. He thought he saw 2 or 3 more sparks flash across the land. He wanted to ask his master, Usu, what it was, but Ursu had not yet come out of the cave they shared, and Jen did not want to go in and disturb him if he was thinking. The sky was turning black. Jen had seen storms before, but none as dark as this. Yeah. He remembered the day his mother had died. He was frightened of the darkness. The ripples had altered again, and the thunder was getting louder. Only one sun was visible. Yeah, Thra has multiple suns, in case you were wondering. Okay. Only one sun was visible, and that was hazed by cloud. Jen decided that he would play on his flute. Harmony is the sound that goodness makes, or so the chanter said. Jen had to do something to answer the storm. In a distant land, the storm raged across the sky above a brooding castle. Clouds rippled, purple, yellow, gray, black. Eerie lights glinted and vanished in momentary cloud caverns. Lightning cursed the ground, and stray beams of sunlight swept across it like moving spokes to the bleak crag on which the castle stood. Now and then a pulse, a flash, surged across deserts, forests, ravines, craters, rivers, and mountains along ley lines of energy from the standing stones in the valley of the Uru. It was as though the castle was sucking up the land's power to withstand the storm overhead. Some borrowed or stolen force might have accounted for the precedence in that furious sky of one vent in the clouds directly above the central tower. Though the vent steadily shone one strong beam from the sun at noon, the beam penetrated the castle tower through a triangular port at its highest point. Within the tower it directly struck a huge crystal, wine dark in color, suspended in mid-air by its own gravity. The crystal was quartz-like, with threefold symmetry, rhodohedral at its top and base. But what had once had a mineral magnificence was now cracked, decaying. Near the top was a cavity where a sliver of the crystal, a shard, was missing altogether. From the crystal the light was refracted into separate beams which slanted sharply downward. The beams nearest to ventricle traveled on down a shaft cut in the living rock, at the foot of which, deep beneath the crystal, they met a lake of fire. Around the shaft opened a vast ceremonial chamber, triangular in shape, and there the crystal's reflected beams created a circle of pools of dark radiance on the floor. 9 of the pools of light were vacant. In each of the other 9 beams stood the sinister reptilian figure of the Skeksis, all of them with their hooded eyes uneasily above their beak-like jaws, were surreptitiously watching the door, and the thick layers of robes with which they had draped their skinny, scaly bodies over eons, never removing a layer but adding another as one decayed. They stood bulky and almost motionless, imbibing the cosmic radiance from the dark crystal above them with a kind of thirst. But their unblinking eyes were not still, and their talons twitched as they watched for their emperor. Had he the strength to join them in the ceremony? If so, the sun's rays, enriched and vibrant with the crystal, might revive him for the brief period until the great conjunction, and the power he would take on then would sustain him for eons more. If he was unable to join them now, he would not live long enough. In that event, one of the 9 would become the new emperor. The design of the floor where the Skeksis stood was a spiral maze. An eye tracing it would eventually return to the point of the pattern from which it had started. Except that the maze, being spiral, would appear to flow into a third dimension. It had no end and therefore no beginning, yet it progressed. Thus it was timeless, infinitely present, and so could be taken to be a representation of time, which cannot be pictured by those who imagine themselves linear subjects to it. The pattern of the spiral maze, subtly varied, connected the floors of all the ceremonial chambers in the castle. The triangular walls of the crystal chamber, rising to meet at the open portal high above the crystal, had been fashioned by fine masons, honest to their craft. Throughout the reign of the Skeksis in that place, ugly embossments had been added, grotesque carvings made in the stone, symbols defaced, gaudy cloths and painted insignia hung, all emblems of power, the pentacle, the nine-pointed star, the four phases of the secret moon of Thra, the Terra keys, hexagrams, pyramids, trihexagons, double helixes, left-handed and right-handed spiral swastikas, the alchemical symbols of the four elements, and the three principles of nature, and most obsessively pictured a triangle containing the congruent circles, the icon of the Great Conjunction. Throughout the castle, along its dark passages, through arches and aisles and chambers large and small, in the filthy dungeons and cells drenched in death, that triangular icon was to be seen, a pilgrim's talisman, a hunter's speculation, a prisoner's reckoning. In the ceremonial chambers, the pool of light lost their radiance. The sun had passed over. The Skeksis began to stir their swaddled bodies again, walking on their hind legs, forelegs poised in the air, talons arched, their heads protruding from the humped cowls, thrust out as if to strike. They watched each other closely. The Emperor had not appeared. Skek-Na, the slave master, nodded a signal to a balcony built into the rock high up beside the crystal. A cover was slowly closed across the triangular portal at the summit of the tower. Outside the castle, the storm started to intensify. A creature that might have been a bird or a bat rose into the air from the battlements. In its claws it clutched a small piece of crystal as it flew away across the landscape, its wings beating with slow deliberation. Another creature of the same breed followed it, and others still heading off in different directions, each grasping a piece of crystal. The storm was closer to the valley now. Jen looked up at the sky. Its colors were reflected on the shivering pool. Soon he would have to find shelter in one of the vacant caves along the spiral pathway. For the time being, he willed himself to stay beside the pool, above the waterfall, playing the flute until the last possible moment. His quiet, secure life among the Uru seldom presented him with the opportunity to be a little brave. He leaned forward and gazed directly down into the pool. "Is that a brave face?" he asked himself aloud. Although the water was not still, he knew his face well enough to see it plainly reflected on the shifting surface. Out of the fringe of thick, dark hair was a countenance made him triangular by the wide cheekbones tapering to a small chin. His large eyes were set well apart on either side of a fattish nose. His gelfling face was framed by long hair, through which his pointed ears protruded. A brave face, he had asked that question often enough, and others a handsome face. Was it an intelligent one, sad, stern? Was it even memorable? All he had for comparison were the luxurious faces of the Uru. Their aged, wrinkled eyes were so different from his bright ones. The skin on their faces was old, deeply lined in runic patterns. Their faces were not even in the same place as was Jen's, but thrust forward on long, thick necks that were covered with manes of gray hair. Then they walked with their heavy, slightly swaying gait on their two powerful legs. Their massive long tails were not heavy enough to counterbalance the weight of their heads. They had to lean on walking sticks, which they held in front of them with one of their pairs of forearms, while their hind arms hung down toward the ground. Their heads were ponderous with wisdom, perhaps, or with memory, or with listening. Their immensely slow and considered movements were made weightier yet by the garment each of them wore, something between a coat and a saddle blanket. These garments had been made for them by Ur-Ut, the weaver, and were fashioned to the individual by the system of knotting threads he used. The complex pattern of knots formed a cybernetic store of each weaver's thoughts, be they the medicinal knowledge of Uno, the herbalist, the astronomic records of Oryod, the numerologist, the microbiotic balances of Ur-Amajay, the cook, or any other of the bodies of erudition that the Uru had been collecting for many eons. The garments were dusty and worn with age, but the colors had remained fast, and the threads had not frayed because Ur-Ut had used no scissors. How could Jen ever have learned about himself by comparison with creatures so entirely different and so much larger, 100 times heavier, quite probably? Everything they had taught him, which was a great deal, had been taught by precept. They would give no examples, not only because of their different physical beings, but also because the knowledge they had was absolutely conceptual. Nothing happened, nothing was apprehended, but it was instantly translated by the Uru into an idea en masse with all the other ideas erected over the eons, like all the dust on their garments. The spirals and runes in the skin of their heads were the grooves of coded thought, representing a symbolic interpretation of each Uru's total past, from which at any moment the future might have been projected by one who could systematically construe the signs. The habitable sadness of their expressions and the marked slowness of their low, resonant speech were evidence of their cerebral natures. Anyone who had never met the Uru might have supposed at first that they labored under a collective guilt, such as their lack of spontaneous action. A brave face. Jen shrugged and sat down again. The storm was heading inexorably in the direction of the valley. The sky was darker now, and a chill edge in the air heralded the first rainfall. Jen played a tune, trying to finger harmonies that might answer the thunderclouds. He double-stopped one pipe of the flute as a kind of chanter, and on the other experimented with the quarter-tone effects he had discovered by partially stopping. He tapped his foot in a slow rhythm, shut his eyes, and improvised a sinuous melody. Da 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 da. When lightning cracked nearby, Jen opened his eyes again. Someone was behind him and towering over him, someone he had not heard approaching. He turned around quietly. It was Urza, the ritual guardian. Standing up straight on his hunched legs, his forearms spread eagled, with his cane pointing to the sky. "Pardon, Ancient One," Jen said, fearing his flute had interrupted Urza's thinking. "I did not mean to disturb you," although Jen reasoned that surely even on Uru's station might be penetrated by a storm such as this. Urza answered in the fashion of the Uru, very slowly, with long pauses. "To mean is not to do," he said. "To make a sound," he reflected for a long time. "Is it trouble the roots of silence? To play the flute is to make a slave of the air." Jen turned away impatiently. "I know," he replied. "You've told me that before." At once he wished he had not sounded the note of rudeness. It was not that he had any fear of punishment. In all his time with the Uru, none of them had ever chastised him, however subtly. Whenever he had spoken or behaved or behaved badly, the worst that had ensued after a long meditative pause was a somber sentence of philosophical correction. He doubted, in fact, that it was possible to upset one of them. Now he regretted what he had said, only because it muffled the genuine respect he felt for Ur-Zai and all the others. Still, as the Uru themselves quite often said, a word spoken is a step taken. Jen sat there, feeling awkward. He fingered his flute, but thought he had better not play in case it was offending Ur-Zai. The Uru had not made a move, but was still standing over Jen, his head cocked. Then he said, "In your cave there is one who has need." "My master?" Jen asked. He stood up with a little sob of anxiety. His master Uzur had never before sent for him in the middle of the day. Why now? Orzal was gazing at the sky. "The storm comes," he observed. "It is time of change." He paused. "Time of trial." So that was it. Something was to change and be tested. That was what the storm portended. Jin looked into Orzaz's weary, kind face and nodded hesitantly. He had always known that this day, sooner or later, would come. The skills and intuitions that the Uru had cultivated in him while sheltering his childhood were always designed to prepare Jen for some task. The Uru had never told him what the task would be, and truth to tell, Jen had never pressed them for an explanation. With all this wishing that things could be altered, that the Uru would let him roam more freely, and especially that all the other Gelfling would come back and live with him, he did not want to lose what he had. He ran up the spiral pathway. He was only just in time. The storm was breaking on the valley now. The wind, it was blowing about more than dust and spray from the waterfalls. The very stones were being shaken by it. Jen could feel little pebbles pattering on his skin. Why were the him the healer, or now the herbalist, and Urso the chanter standing together outside the cave Jen shared with Urso? Was there danger in the storm? What were they talking about? The three Uru moved aside, slowly to let him pass. What must it be like for them, he wondered, to be so heavy and slow, and see one running as fleetly as he did. Now his master would tell him why the sky was turbulent, such black force, scolding clouds that seemed to have a purpose. It was a day like none he had ever known, and he did not like it. Whatever it was that the storm wanted for him, nothing in his life would ever again be as it had always been. "Master, here I am." As Jen stepped into the cave, through the entrances carved with the most elaborate runes of all the caves along the pathway, the storm outside rose to a crescent of a gale, and rain and thunderclaps. Jen paused for a moment beside his own small bed, carved into the wall of the cave, while his eyes and ears and breathed attunely themselves. He could see his master at the rear of the cave, dropped across the sleep frame and supported his massive weight. That was another strange occurrence today. His master never rested during the daytime, but was always at work with his books and his instruments, or conferring with other Uru. "Master?" Ursu, his head in an awkward position, stirred and looked up at Jen. "Master, what does this storm mean?" Ursu gestured weakly for Jen to draw nearer. When he had done so, Jen experienced an alarm much greater than that which the storm had caused him. Ursu was prostrate. His breathing was labored and noisy. His eyes seemed cloudy, unable to focus clearly on Jen. His face was pale. "Master, what is wrong?" Ursu panted for breath before he could answer. "I was born," he said, and the rest of the sentence was a mumble. Jen cocked his head to indicate that he had not understood. His master waved his hand to act for patience. He struggled to bring his breathing under control. I was born under a shattered sky, he finally got out. Jen swallowed hard, forcing himself to remain calm. Please, it's me, Jen. Again the Ancient One waved his hand with impatience. His mouth moved, shepherded the words. A crystal sang, he breathed heavily in. A crystal sang to the three made one. The dark column, the rose column, and the radiance itself. Jen moved closer. Leaning down to speak, his master muttered, Listen, you must understand. You must. After 929 thrine plus 1 thrine, the great conjunction, the crystal sang. I was born, Skeksis too. Jen stood there, quite wretched, afraid of the changes in his life, and bewildered by the responsibility that he felt his master's laborious muttering was imposing on him. He had no idea what he was to do with these fragments of knowledge, if knowledge they were, and not merely the pointless ravings of someone mortally sick, any more than he could imagine what he ought to do to help his master now. You are ill, Jen said. You must rest. If he could calm his master, he would go fetch Orlem, the healer, who with his sense of an aura could lay on hands and perhaps everything would be right again. Orso took no notice. Thrice times 6 were the Urskeks, he went on, with a kind of chanting rhythm to conserve his breath. Dark the crystal shattered the sky. Great pain the Skeksis, they evil dark, their rule. Jen was trying to concentrate on the torn words in obedience to his master's injunction to understand, but at the same time he was miserable with the realization that Erlim, who had seen outside the cave, must already have visited the master and left because there was nothing more he could do for him. Great power, Ursu continued, a new access of breath. Not again, not renewed, not Skeksis, not if Gelfling. You, he groaned with the pain of his sickness. You make it whole, you must all whole, Gelfling again. Drawing on his last reserves of strength, Urso raised his arm and held it over a copper bowl of liquid that was on the floor beside his sleep frame. His 3 long fingers and thumb pointed at the surface of the liquid, which at once turned cloudy outside the cave. A bolt of lightning struck with such force that Jen felt the ground shudder beneath him. Then, bemused, he watched the bowl of liquid, for it was forming itself into a shape, an image, a picture of a mountain. On top of the mountain he could plainly see a curiously domed building. Orsa's eyes were shut fast. All his remaining energy was now concentrated into forming the picture in the bowl, and the words he still struggled to speak. A wanderer may come, he muttered. His voice was faint, but by now Jen's ears had attuned themselves. Come from under the mountain, bringing murder and birth. Master, in Jen's voice was bewilderment and tenderness. It was close to tears. Orso clenched his fingers and released them from an electricity that was out of keeping with the rest of his inert body. The clouded picture in the bowl changed. What took its place was the image of a piece of crystal, a dagger-shaped fragment, which glinted in the cloudy liquid below Oru's pointing fingers. Mark this crystal shard, Orso intoned in a faint, distant chant. An orphan must restore it. Heal the wound at the core of being. Wanderer, orphan, Gelfling Jen, with this tool you may forge a fate now. Orso's eyes flickered upon a look at Jen. Now you are alone. The image of the dagger-shaped crystal shard faded beneath Orso's fingers at the moment of its disappearance. It sounded a high-pitched ring of 2 notes, which sang through the walls of the cave, and then died away very slowly. All that was left was the noise of Urso's heavy breathing. The liquid in the copper bowl had evaporated. Urso's hand hung down limp. "Alone?" Jen asked. "But what about you? What about all the Uru, Master?" The ancient Uru's eyes were shut fast again. In a voice that sounded as though it came from the threshold of another world, he said, "Your journey must begin. The 3 brother suns will not wait." He paused. "Remember me, Jen. We may meet again, but not in this life." Jen said nothing. He knew that words would be wasted. He stood, his face very still, aware of his small breathing in comparison with the gasping sound that came from his master. The storm continued to rage around the castle of the dark crystal. Through the dark halls of the castle swaggered the most massive and brutal of the Skeksis, Shrek Ung, the Gartham master, decked in a robe of armor pieces that glittered and rattled as he marched. His spurs stuck sparks from the stone floor. The mad, cold eyes and the yellow fangs, revealed in a characteristic sneer, aroused a prehistoric fear in all who saw him, even in the other Skeksis. He was unusually among them in having held his position ever since their reign had begun. Their numbers had dwindled from 18 to 10. Skeksis had been promoted to fill the offices that had fallen vacant. But this was always and ever the Gartham master. From the first, the strongest and most violent of them, the Gartham, he maintained, were his creation. To him was due all the honor of the foul instrument by means of which the Skeksis had terrorized the land. They were the strike force of the Skeksis, huge and black, carpiced, mighty clawed like giant fleas with their dangling tentacles. Always some were standing like sentries along the corridors of the castle, lifeless until activated by a command. Others were held in reserve in a pit beneath the castle floors. The Gartham were scarcely creatures at all, more like the impulse of a cruel brain made over into crustacean objects. Nightmare crabs, swift monsters designed for one purpose only, destruction. For any one of them there was no singular noun. They were the plural extensions of one will of evil. The Gartham master took fierce pride in them. Now he was marching to claim the reward he had been awaiting all these centuries, the throne. Everyone would see the emperor was dying. This time no other Skeksis would be able to resist the Gartham master's ascension. As he approached the ornate doorway of the emperor's bedchamber, he was startled by the sudden appearance of Skeksil, the chamberlain, who insinuated himself in the middle of the corridor in front of him. In spite of himself, the Gartham master hissed in a moment of alarm and hesitated. Then he snorted and strolled absolutely on past the only Skeksis who might oppose him as the new emperor. The chamberlain stayed where he was, twisting his scrawny neck around to watch the Gartham master. He turned then and followed him toward the doorway. His moist and uncouthous body bore up, squeezily bowed as he entered the imperial bedchamber. Under his arm he carried scrolls and... A sec here, I want to see. What is this? Goodness. Okay. In his arm he carried scrolls and administrative papers. He knew the dying emperor would be in no condition to attend to them, but he wished to remind the other Skeksis of his official position, the chief secretary and therefore next in line to the throne. He eyed the rest of the Skeksis assembled around the sumptuous bed and smiled at each one of them with oily suspicion. The Gartham Master's ambition was plain, but would any of the others make a bid? Not the Slave Master, with his patch to cover a mutilated eye socket and his hook for one hand. He had no fitting experience for it, no imagination, no nobility at all. Clearly not Skek Aruk, the gourmand, who was too slovenly and slothful to care. Not Skek Urt, the ornamentalist, whose decadence and perversion could never command obedience, and least of all Skek Oak, the scroll keeper, that vacant idiot who continually mumbled to himself. That left there to consider and scuttle Skek Sod, the treasurer, was no dangerous threat. Being administratively subordinate to the Chamberlain and knowing nothing of executive responsibilities, all he knew was how to bite gold. Skektek, the scientist, however, was another matter. The others feared him because they could not understand nothing of his work. He had amputated his own leg and arm in order to fit himself with appliances he had invented that were more powerful than the natural limbs. Likewise, he had cut out part of his circulatory system and substituted a series of exposed transparent tubes in order to study the operation of his own blood and juices. Ew. Gross. Some thought him demented, and he was distrusted by all. Surely he would not be in contention. Finally, there was Skek Sok, the ritual master. Yes, the Chamberlain aimed a special smile at him. With his heretic dignity and his unmatched knowledge of the symbols, the cards, the auguries, and the rituals. There was no denying that the ritual master could be a formidable contender, and yet he had never given any indication of cavorting the throne, until now. At least, he had always seemed satisfied with the spiritual cannibalistic power he unquestionably exercised. He might well have no taste for the fight, which would surely be a vicious one, where the Garden Master persisted in his vain, absurd pretensions. The Emperor laid on his bed, his face dark against the white pillow, and growing darker all the time, like a withering plum. The Skeksis knew what that portended. The imperial eyes were dull, unfocused, his breath rasped in his long throat, his mouth gaped for air. Across the counterplane his hands were rambling, fingers twitching as though they were seeking something firm to grasp. In one hand was the jeweled scepter, loosely held, 9 pairs of eyes watching it. None of the Skeksis said a word, but all of them were rapidly attentive to every sound and motion. The Chamberlain edged closer in readiness. When the scepter rolled out of the emperor's feeble hand and lay on the counterplane near the edge of the bed, the Chamberlain moved in. He stretched out his hand for it, extending the long talons. The Gartham Master jerked. Taken by surprise, he stiffened, prepared to engage in an unseemly tussle with the Chamberlain. The Emperor's eyes were suddenly wide open and ablaze. His neck whipped with the pillow, and his jaws, full of yellow teeth, snapped like a trap. An inch away from the Chamberlain's outstretched hand, the Chamberlain withdrew his talon with as much dignity as he could muster. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said in the wheedling voice that all the others loathed, "I merely wish to restore the symbol of supreme office to your hand, where it rightfully belongs. It would be shameful were we to allow the scepter of state to fall on the ground." The Gartham Master laughed under his breath, loudly enough to be heard at the end of the corridor. The Emperor's spiteful lunge proved to be the last action of his life, passionately devoted to malevolence. He collapsed back onto the pillow and fell into a coma. The only evidence of enduring life was a small rattling noise in his chest. Then that stopped. A black membrane slid over his eyes. Outside the castle, the last of the thunder died away. Looking furtively around, the chamberlain caught the eyes of both the Gartham master and the ritual master, each of them seemingly fugitive. Well, now he knew then three of them. If only the vicious old brute had confirmed the chamberlain's natural succession, there would have been no trouble. The Garthan master, like all who are competent at giving orders, was also punctilious in obeying them. As for the ritual master, he would not have dared to question the expiring emperor's command, else all his authority would have been slipped from him. Founded as it was in the mysteries of hierarchy, precedence, and predetermination, there would be a contest now. Apart from the aspirants, the other six Skeksis had kept their gaze fixed upon the defunct emperor. His corpse was decomposing with remarkable haste, having no soul to arrest the process. It was like the creation of volcanic rock within the space of a minute or two. His flesh seemed to boil, rise, blacken, and then transform into rock that rapidly developed gaping cracks and festering caves. Soon it crumbled into pebbles. A sour gray dust thinly filmed the air. Night came in fast, faster than an eye could adapt itself to starlight, and later to the small Parmouth moon. For a while the land was immersed in a darkness like ink. It was the time when every creature would fall quiet. From deep within the labyrinthine bowels of the castle, strains of solemn music arose. It was a dirge in three-part harmony, sung by a chorus of slaves, situated in choir stalls at the side of the mausoleum. All the Skeksis' slaves were captured pod people, small and simple folk. Their voices had been alto in their natural state. Some of them, however, had been converted into lower registers by the scientist, who for hundreds of years had experimented with the excursion and implantation of vocal cords, and now felt he had achieved just the right blending of parts. He had no ear for music himself, but the slave master did claim to have one and had taken responsibility for selecting and providing promising pod specimens to the scientist. The result of the experiments were delivered over to the ornamentalist, who was in charge of rehearsals. He made a further selection, incorporating those he liked into the chorus and destroying the rest. The final arbiter was the ritual master, since the chorus sang only on ritual occasions. A harsh judge, he had been known across the chamber to tear the head off a singer who failed to sing his part in tune. That it had happened less often of late was the reason why the scientist felt that in this field of experimentation he had been successful. It had been the scroll keeper's job to collect the emperor's remains and coronated fluids from among the vacant robes laying on the deathbed with a scepter laid beside him. The remains were wound in crements and sealed inside an ebony casket, tetrahedral in shape, bearing on all four sides silver icons of the triangle containing three concentric circles. The casket was then borne into the mausoleum by the ritual master, the chamberlain, and the Gartham master. One at each corner, the other six Skeksis followed in a single file. The strutting slave master, the limping scientist, the treasurer wiggling his hands, the ornamentalist dressed in peacock silks and rich jeweled pieces, the gourmand whipping the corners of his mouth, and last the scroll keeper had arrived late. In arranging the procession, the ritual master, the chamberlain, and the Gartham master had disregarded over which of them should precede the others by bearing the foremost corner of the casket. The ritual master argued that he was officiating at the ceremony. The chamberlain pointed out that, at least for the present, he was the senior functionary of the state, and the Gartham master insisted that he had the chief executive responsibility for maintaining order and security. In view of the sculptural occasion, they found a temporary compromise, although each of them knew that it would not long outlast the emperor's funereal casket. As they trod the spiral maze the mausoleum floor, the three of them also wheeled gravely around the axis of the casket in their hands, in a stately measure. The pod people's slaves, singing in the choir stalls, would have laughed at the spectacle had they been capable of laughter. The procession threaded its spiral way to the center of the mausoleum, which was lit by urns whose flickering cast grotesque shadows across the great vaulted floor. The ritual master, the chamberlain, and the garden master laid the casket on a broad obsidian catafalque draped in black silk, shot through with threads of gold. The ritual master assumed his position in the head of the fig. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but the chamberlain and the garden master withdrew to join the other Skeksis in a circle around the catafalque. The ritual master raised his eyes and intended, Gigon, Yadzirkagade, Akira, Kazda. The rest repeated it after him. Then the ritual master shook his bony claws free of his robes and pointed at the treasurer, who stood immediately to the right of the circle. Hot kafata, sakan, kiharan, the treasurer responded, leaning forward and bowing his head. The rest repeated it in unison. And so around the circle, while the chorus of slaves chanted quietly, each Skeksis intoned the same phrase, which all then repeated in a rite consigning the emperor's soul, which had never existed, to the protection of a higher being in which none of the Skeksis could have tolerated belief. It was a ceremony of reassurance to the survivors. It was also an opportunity for the chamberlain and the garden master to vie with each other in expressing their plenty of homage. Both were resentful of the advantage the ritual master had in the matter. At a signal from the ritual master, a slave came forward, bearing around the circle a large copper bowl ornamented with silver. From it, the Skeksis took a smoking orb made of a translucent material that glowed with some inner combustion. They faced the casket. Kirkan, Yazgade, Akira, Tread Konghang, the ritual master screeched, raising his talons high above his head. The choir's voices swelled to a climax. The ritual master let his hands fall to his chest, and simultaneously the rest of the Skeksis drew the glowing orbs into the catafalque, crying, Ha Kihahan, in their harsh, croaking voices. The catafalque was at once transformed into a pyre, blazing with the white brilliance of a dying star. The Skeksis stood in a silent, watching circle as the gold-shot silks were consumed in flames and the casket was reduced to smoldering embers. In the cave, Jen stood quiet still for a long time, gazing at the empty, runic garment on the sleep frame. He had seen death before, among the small creatures of the valley, but it had never been like this. His master had seemed to evaporate like a pure spirit. It was as though that whitely body had never been more than an idea in the mind of whatever it was that inhabited the flesh. An idea that had now been forgotten, discarded. Whatever it was, it passed on to another, invisible idea. Would that be in here, Jen wondered, or somewhere else? He knew that for a long time, perhaps forever, he would have the sense that his master was present wherever he went, always walking beside him. He could not have brought himself to say anything that Ursula would not have liked to hear. The grief went deep in Jen, but deeper still, beneath it, he detected something hard. It was difficult to define, but it felt like courage, a new power in him, and new confidence. He examined it gingerly. He was afraid to learn exactly what it was in case it turned out to be pride, the guilty, arrogant tone of those who have survived. But he thought courage would be something more gentle than that. He would wait and get to know it. How strange, he reflected, that at a time of calamity he should gain something simple and strong, and perhaps precious. Were all good and true lessons to be learned only at such cost? How long he stood there he did not know, but eventually he turned and walked to stand in the mouth of the cave. looking out over the valley. The storm had cleared away, leaving behind it a sky of scrub clean and blue. The creatures of the valley were running around, sniffing the sunshine. Down below in the Thorwag, the bottom of the valley, you could see the Uru gathering around the standing stones that formed a triangle there. Directed by Ursa, they set out what was necessary for a funeral. Down the spiral path from Sursu's cave, they carried his coat, which the process of dematerialization had now reduced to a cobwebby thing, frail and dry on abandoned chrysalis. This, together with his few other personal belongings, they placed at the foot of the tallest of the stones, another stone which lay flat in the center of the triangle. They laid his walking stick, the master's staff of office, dominically carved from one thick branch of hard nutwood. At the upper end it was inset a small, perfectly formed rock crystal. For hours they calculated the precise positions of the remaining objects that were needed to furnish the funeral ceremony. Small fetuses, prayer sticks, stones, feathers, and pots. Watching them make the arrangements, Jen finally became impatient. In spite of his grief over the occasion, throughout his life among the Uru, at the edge of his gratitude for their kindness, to an orphan he had felt himself quietly chafing at their immensely patient attention to detail. What they called their work seemed to him to connect one thing to another. Sometimes it was quite literal. He had seen Orno with his eye patch and splintered finger spend days on end with a pebble and 4 blue feathers discover all the permutations that could result from binding the objects together with a length of stirring. Other connections that Uru made were figurative. When the wind was in a certain quarter, it blew down the spiral path, and filling tunnels and passing the mouths of caves, it resounded through the valley like a reed pipe. At such times the Uru never tried of arranging their own bodies to stop some of the cave mouths, so that the pitch of the wind would be modulated. Why bother, Jen wondered, on his own little bifurcated flute? He could demonstrate the same effect and play a melody at the same time. In their collective obsession with rituals, there was nothing selfish about the Uru. It affected everything in their lives, even the ordinary business of a day. Sleeping, eating, walking, talking. It was always too slow for Jen, this labored, mannered, painstaking connection of things. What was the point? Turned inward away from the world, they were, Jen thought, collectors of knowledge for its own sake. Why did they never do anything with it? Why could they not make the only connection that seemed to him useful, applying all their knowledge to change the world? As he had grown older, he had tried, politely, to press his master for the answers. Urso, however, had simply traded concepts. One's body was a rehearsal of the history of the world. What one ate and thought was one's future. The better you know me, Urso had said, the better you will know the world as it will be without me. And now Jen faced a world without Ursa. The new spark of confidence he had, to his surprise, found himself his master's death, was still there within him, but confidence to what end? To forge a fate, Urso had said as he lay dying, to heal the wound, to make it whole. What fate? What wound? What was expected of him? He had never been able to envision a future for himself. Expect one in which his influent memories, his mother, father, other Gelfling, would become realities again. But whenever he had wished for that to happen, laying in bed at night, closing his eyes, pressing together the tips of his thumbs and forefingers, his concentration on those memories had led straight through to something he feared. Some blackness, cruel pain, weeping. Was the past always stalking the present, waiting to destroy it? Orso had told him that a two-dimensional question like that had no solution, and therefore no meaning. Make a triangle with a past, present, and future. Then each two will explain the third. Nothing is except energy. Urso had said another time, energy exists only when a connection can be made. Connect one to one, and you will have energy that will serve your life. Connect one to one to one, and nothing will ever be the same again. Look at my face, Jen. What you see was born when three were made one. Look harder now, harder than you have ever known how to look, and you might see that three will be made one again. What do you mean, Master? It is hard to understand. Can you not put it more simply? It is already as simple as it can be. That is why you find it hard to understand. Toward the end of the night, the Uru waited the dawn, the twilight in which a spirit feels most at peace. Their funeral ceremony was prepared. 7 of them sat in positions that, together with the 3 standing stones, formed a terragius. Set apart on one side was Ur-it, with a harp, facing the rest with a knoll behind the tallest stone. At the apex of the triangle was Ur-za-jen. Sitting beside him was encouraged to play his flute throughout the night watch. Because of his special relationship to Ursu, in thought of Urza, were 3 pots. When the first pale flush of dawn light tingled the mists rising around the stones, Ursa gently pushed Jen's flute away from his lips. At the same moment, Ur-it struck a plangent harmony that resonated for a long time. The next to sound was Ur-tai, the alchemist, who used his right front arm, an artificial limb of wood, like the right leg, to make a bowl sing. It was a bowl he had fashioned from 7 metals, and when he drew his wooden arm firmly around the rim, the bowl howled as though with the voice of a wandering spirit, oscillating when he tipped the water inside it from side to side. Others joined in, working to a slow pulsed rhythm. Or not describe. A touch of dawn light had activated a small crystal at the end of the master's staff, where it lay on the central stone. First the crystal glowed as though concentrating the light in itself. Then the wood around it smoldered and began to burn. The flame moved slowly down the stick, away from the crystal, leaving behind a line of white embers with scorch mark on the stone. The smoke curled into the mists, which were filling with light. Orza packed up one of the 3 pots in front of him and tipped it upside down, pouring a stream of dry soil into Jen's hand. Ur-Ute was playing in the longest register of his harp, and Ur-Sol directed the chorus accordingly. Would the ground be one, Ursa told Jen. He threw the pot away. It shattered on the tallest standing stone, scattering fragments over Ursu's coat. Ursa picked up the second pot. Ur-Ut and Ur-Sol moved to the middle register. With the pot, Ursa poured water over Jen's hand. With water be one. He threw the pot out of the first and picked up the third, the harp enchanting sword. When Ursa upturned the pot, nothing came out. With the air be one. He handed the pot to Jen, who looked at him questioningly. Ursa offered no answer. Jen threw the pot against the stone where it shattered. Ursa nodded slowly. The staff had burned itself away. Its expiring smoke rose to meet a labyrinth wraith of mist that seemed to be descending into the triangle of stones. Jen saw that the coat of Ursa had now evaporated into nothingness. Only the shards of the smashed pots remained where the coat had been. Be one, Jen, Ursa told him, and make one. Now you must go as the master told you. Go? Jen asked. Go where? What must I do? For years he had yearned to leave the valley. The Uru had raised him with loving care. At the appointed times they had cut his hair, taught him to swim, to tie knots, to sharpen a knife, had initiated him into the mysteries of music and the principles of geometry, had tested him by tasks and isolation, but never had they allowed him to explore outside the valley. And now that he was bidden to leave, he wished to remain. to say he was not yet ready. The truth, he realized, was that he did not want to abandon what was familiar and customary. Besides, it was one thing to wish to explore, it was quite belt. You must go where the master showed you, Orzon told him. Watches the heavens and keeps your secrets. Warsaw showed me such an image in a bowl, but I don't know where the place is. How do I get there? What am I supposed to do there? And who is Agra? Warsaw replied in his slow voice, Your need is to go with questions, not with answers, as the cave needs the mountain. Jen controlled a raising feeling of panic. But Warsaw, you can see the future, can't you? Please at least tell me what will happen. I paused. The Uru continued their chanting as the sun rose above the rim of horizons. The future is many futures, Orzal told him. We see them all. Which one will be yours? Is for you to seek. And the standing stone near them, they pictured 3 congruent circles inside a triangle. This I will tell you, Orzal went on. Very soon the 3 made one will look down. Great vibrations will be felt by all who touch rock. Unless by then you have found the future you must seek, and made what was broken whole, what was dark light, then nothing can be whole and dark, will be the fate of all creatures on Thra. But I am frightened of what is dark, Orzal. With reason, the Aura replied. Darkness impersons the light. Darkness destroys all beings, converts all energy. It is evil. What is evil? Jen asked. Evil does not exist, Orzal answered. Evil is disharmony between existences. Now go, Gelfling, with your questions. Orzal turned away, faced the sun, enjoyed the chanting of the Uru. Jen took his first step up the spiral path leading out of the valley. When he reached the cave where he lived with Warsaw, he paused and looked down into the Thalreg. Rising up to him came the deep, 9-toned chant of the Uru. He saw that they were all staring up at him. Whether it was their gaze or their chant or the seed of courage he had experienced at Warsaw's death, he did not know, but a force propelled him past the mouth of the cave and on up the spiral path. At the shoulder of the valley, higher than he had ever been on his own, he glanced back once more. The waterfalls were tiny, sparkling jewels in the early sunlight. He took a deep breath. For the resurgence of a familiar object in a strange world, he put his hand up to touch his flute, which he carried on a leather neck string. Near him was another line of standing stones. They were tall and narrow, shooting up from the ground like needles. Soon from the valley below, they had always marked the boundary of his world. On them he saw carvings, similar to those on stones that formed the triangle down below, where the chanting of the Uru continued, still surprisingly distinct, even from where Jen stood. Perhaps Jen thought the carvings might offer him some indication of the direction he was supposed to take. He approached the nearest stone to examine it. It had a black patina on it, like soot. He reached out to rub it off, but withdrew his hand sharply. The stone was burning hot. He remembered what he had seen the previous day, sparks traveling across the valley and over its rim. These stones must have been struck by lightning. He breathed deeply again and walked on over the shoulder of the valley and out of sight of his home. After a few steps, the ground in front of him began to slope down again. Soon Jen was standing on the brink of a wide, bowl-shaped plain, lush with vegetation and sprinkled with woods. Far away on the misty horizon, the plain terminated in a range of round hills. To the high hill, Orzal had said. That must be the direction he had to take. Okay. Whew. All right. That was, sorry, that was like, these chapters are kind of long. That was just the first chapter. Yeah, and I see that I have a timer and it's telling me I've been doing this for like an hour. Okay, so chapter 2 is on Agra's High Hill. Of course, I think I've done enough reading. Yeah, it's a very good book. You can get it off of Amazon. How much did I pay for this? Let's see. Yeah, like $15, $15 US. I think maybe there's a hardcover of this. Yeah, I mean, there's, otherwise. Yeah, and I did say there was a novelization of Labyrinth, which I've not read. I have read this whole book. I just want to give you a taste of the first chapter. I really do like it. After reading this novelization, I watched the movie again, and it's a companion to the movie. It does not take away from them. I think it adds to it. A lot of stuff that's in this book was originally how they wanted it to be. I mean, A.C.H. Smith and, because Jim Henson wrote this whole storyline up, and and A.C.H. Smith kind of like worked with him to try to figure out the storyline for it. But I think it's a lot neater, I think. It really portrays Jen as kind of like, it's kind of a brave soul to get ready for this quest that he doesn't really particularly want to go on, and he's not really sure what he's supposed to do. Because I like his master dying, and I know when they say a pure spirit, doesn't that remind you of Obi-Wan Kenobi? Remember when, it doesn't remind you of Star Wars? When a Jedi of the light dies, they kind of fade away and their cloak just drops to the ground. It's that same kind of presence that the Uru have a soul and the Skeksis do not. So it could be thought that the Skeksis are the body and the Uru are the soul or something. Well, I really have seen the movie that, originally there was a race that was there. They had come to Thraw from another world, and, maybe, or Skeks or whatever. Yes, and then supposedly something happened to the crystal during a great they appeared during a great conjunction. And then supposedly the crystal got cracked, and then what happened was that the Urskeks were changed forever into Uru and Skeksis. The Uru and Skeksis are one of a whole, They are the same race, but they're kind of split in half. So it's like their good and evil side is like turned into two, like one being was turned into many, And of course, many strife, many wars. The Uru were eventually banished to the valley that we see them in. I don't know if any of you have seen the Dark Crystal miniseries. There's many references to the Uru and stuff, and like where they are and what's particularly going on. Of course, since the series has kind of ended, I don't know what's going to happen with that. I might do a video where I talk about what I think, how it should end, and I don't really know. I don't know who Jen and Kira's parents are. I'm not really sure I could figure that out, but yeah. I hope that a comic book or something finishes this up. I really hate to see that this storyline doesn't have a way to come full circle with the movie and stuff. Anyway, thanks for staying here if you were staying here. I don't think I'm going to want to read the book like anymore. I might find parts of it I can bring out and talk about, perhaps. Some parts of it are funny. A lot of the interactions and many things are like completely different in this book than in the movie. But I definitely suggest read this and then go watch the movie. This is a companion to the movie. It does not take away from the movie. I think it's a very good companion of it. You can see there's a lot of complex words in this book. But the writing is big. It's easier to read. The pages feel kind of nice. Anyway, yeah, so I definitely suggest you can go into Amazon and trying to pick this book up or find it wherever you can. There's other books about visual histories of the Dark Crystal and many other references. And probably check out Labyrinth, the novelization. I'm going to try to find that because that's kind of cool. Yeah, and I've heard that the Labyrinth is going to be redone, like, the Dark Crystal miniseries. They're going to do a miniseries of it. I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to give us a miniseries and then not finish it? This is why we didn't do a Dark Crystal, because we want to do a Labyrinth? And what is it going to be on, Netflix? No, whatever. It will probably be good. I love the Dark Crystal miniseries. I do. But I'm unhappy that it didn't end. Don't know what happens. I can't really try to contemplate as a fan how this is supposed to go. But anyway, I will talk to you guys later on the next show. Maybe I'll do, probably do a game. I still got Mega Man 8, but I assure you I am going to get that finished. I know I said that about Xenogears, and I still haven't finished that, but anyway. Yeah. Well, I'll see you guys on the next show. Thanks for watching. Please like and comment. And if you want me to try to read different excerpts out of this book, or maybe I find some other books I could read excerpts from. Anyway, I'll catch you guys later. Bye.